Hi everyone. We'll be talking through landscape pattern analysis this week and the contents of chapter 4. So this chapter really is a primer in a lot of ways in GIS, and my assumption is that many of you have either taken GIS or been exposed to it or plan to take it. So I've tried to keep this pretty high level. The end of the chapter that gets into spatial statistics, we're not going to dive too deep into that, but want to make sure we're all on the same page with just some of the principles and themes that govern this aspect of landscape ecology. So we know that understanding landscape pattern is absolutely integral to this discipline. The analysis of landscapes and other spatial data is a major focus of landscape ecology. It's essential to the study of how landscape patterns can affect ecological processes. And it also has relevance for conservation, resource management, sustainable land use. So landscape pattern analysis has benefited in recent years, of course, from advances in computing, remote sensing, GIS, the development of landscape modeling and analysis software. And I think it's safe to say without the advances that we've seen in technology, the discipline would certainly not be where it is today. The two are so intertwined. The book does a nice deep dive in the history of being able to see the landscape from a bird's eye view, literally here. We have some nice records of historic land surveys, which of course were collected on foot. The earliest aerial photograph and satellite images only date back about 100 years. So if we want to see surveyed data earlier than that, we are looking at likely flawed data and certainly not contiguous data across the landscape. So some of our oldest survey records, all collected on foot, do provide a really invaluable glimpse into the early distribution and condition of landscapes. A few of these even include pre-colonization assessments, the U.S. public land surveys, which resulted from an ordinance in 1785, were meant to define how this act actually defined how the U.S. should go about surveying, subdividing, and selling off largely unmapped territory northwest of the Ohio River. So a lot of the U.S. was surveyed according to the protocols of the U.S. Public Land Survey. It created a grid system, and the grid system often marked corners describing both the species and age class of trees in those corners. And in some cases, that gives us some of our best information on distribution and species of trees in that pre-European landscape. It's, of course, important to note that there's probably some surveyor bias in the types of trees that were being marked and selected as corner trees. Remote sensing, it can be argued that landscape ecology really owes its existence to remote sensing. Some of the first aerial photographs were obtained through hot air balloons, then from kites, then from pigeons with cameras attached to them. The Dust Bowl and the growth of the federal agriculture and forestry programs used aerial photography as a means of mapping soils and land use types and crop conditions. USDA and USGS maintained archives of the aerial photos and maps. The classic USGS topo Clyde maps are derived from aerial photography, and that case, cartographers used stereo plotters that allowed them to figure out elevation by overlaying photographs and analyzing the spatial shifts. There was a time that all that was done by hand. And of course, now we have stereo plotting software that does that for us. Color infrared images, which were sensitive to light and longer wavelengths. They added a fourth spectrum of channel that requires that we shift the spectrum of visible light for humans in order to make the infrared spectrum visible to us. So in this case, when we're looking at infrared images that give us a little bit more information, green becomes blue, red becomes green, and that infrared spectrum becomes red. And anything that's blue actually appears black in these images. So these color infrared images are less sensitive to the blue spectrum in the atmosphere that causes scattering, and so actually give us a higher resolution, higher quality image than non-infrared. And it's these infrared spectrum images are also important for actually being able to detect vegetation condition and plant health and biomass. They give us a little more information. And I have a link here just to a short video on evolution of aerial photography. That's sort of fun to watch. So let's talk through how we measure elevation with spatial data. Some of our first models for measuring elevation we refer to as DEMs, or digital elevation models. These are examples of orthorectification, so a geometric image correction. It's a means of combining characteristics from photos with correct spatial scaling, and DEMs allow us to correct the terrain distortions in aerial images in order to create continuous variation in elevation, and we're able to convert that to raster data. DEMs really provide the basis for most topographic relief maps, such as USGS's National Elevation Data Set, but increasingly scientists are relying on more accurate LiDAR. LiDAR is really replacing aerial photography as a means of creating topographic maps. LiDAR acronym stands for Light Detecting and Ranging. It relies on a laser scanner and flights, aerial flights, and laser scanners are used to detect how long it takes to receive a return signal almost instantaneously, and in essence creates a three-dimensional scan of the landscape. So the resolution of the images allow LiDAR to play a role in things like forest inventory. It can also capture depth in rivers, lakes, and coastal waters up to 50 meters. After 50 meters, sonar is preferred for mapping the bottom of our ocean topography. Another technique is synthetic aperture radar that uses microwave signals to detect the Earth's surface in a really fine resolution. It has the ability to penetrate cloud cover, unlike radar, and it's being used to detect things like future landslides, polar ice shrinking, three-dimensional mapping of species habitats. So I think we can expect technology to continue to advance in this realm as well. Satellite imagery. So some of the first satellites used to measure the Earth's surface were launched in 1972. We know that first launch now as Landsat 1. Now there have been 9 actually Landsat missions all through the USGS Earth Explorer program. So chapter 4 goes into a good bit of detail describing how time-stamped satellite images can be compared via normalized difference vegetation indices to identify changes in vegetated areas using multispectral data. How healthy active vegetation has a unique spectral signature. Scientists in this photo were able to monitor the change in the Colorado River Delta after an experimental pulse of water was released in March of 2014, and to see the resulting vegetative response to that pulse release. The notes on the left here sort of outline some of the Landsat missions and the milestones that occurred with them. But today, Landsat isn't the only satellite system out there monitoring the Earth's surface. MODIS satellite scans the Earth every 1 to 2 days. It's at a much coarser resolution than the Landsat scans that are occurring every 8 days. But it scans to the level of about 500 meters and allows us to detect things. For instance, the U.S. Forest Service uses that MODIS data to help monitor and map wildfires in real time. With the more frequent return interval, that's really helpful. We also have commercial vendors out there that have launched satellites to create really high resolution, sub 1 meter resolution images, such as Digital Globe, and those images can be purchased by scientists that need that sort of resolution. Also, advancing quickly are UVAs. So UVAs are drone. UVA stands for unmanned aerial vehicles. Have the potential to really once again revolutionize spatial ecology. There's just been rapid increase in miniaturization and cost reduction, advancements in embedded GPS information, cameras, computers that have all contributed to the use of UVAs for kind of meeting a gap between photography and satellite imagery. Flight time on drones and the image system continues to sort of constrain the use. There's some flight limits also on altitude, and of course limits on flight altitude with the FFA. So landscape data analysis, and here's where we get into some GIS 101 that you guys are likely familiar with. To start, we just want to go over the basics of vector data versus raster data. So vector data is better for representing discrete features with complex geometries. It gives us fluid polygon data that represents points or lines in the landscape. Data tends to be smaller, more easily manipulated. Vector is corrector and raster is faster is the old adage that was in your textbook. Raster data is usually preferred for representing continuous surfaces or features that lack defined boundaries. Elevation or soil data can be used to reflect landscape features in a grid format with individual cells containing information about that location in the landscape. What you're seeing on the right in the figure is is a representation of raster data based on vector data. So obviously we in GIS can convert from raster to vector and vice versa. This figure gives an example of the same. It's just the same data in vector format versus raster format, and kind of goes over some of the different types of data that we view in geographic information systems, such as point data, line data. Roads and rivers are a good example of line data. Area data, such as land cover data. Network data, and then surface data, such as elevation. This figure is an example of how we frequently combine both vector data and raster data when we're doing spatial analyses. This gives us a sense of how we might overlay political boundaries with roads and land parcel information, and then bring in raster data that captures things like land cover type and elevation. And all of this data, of course, gets pulled into the next part of this lecture, which is just a very high-level GIS 101. So when we think about the processes that we go through with GIS, we of course start with our data inputs. So data input is the capture, collection, conversion of spatial information from a variety of sources that might be digitized or scanned maps, it might be satellite images, field or land surveys, administrative or census data, which are combined with non-spatial attributes that tell us something about that data. So there are really 4 types of attribute data that we might see that gets captured in tables or fields associated with our spatial data. So the 4 that we most frequently see are nominal data. That's discrete categories that are identifiers. They might be the name or the class of our spatial data. Ordinal data are ranking order based on hierarchy, such as if we have a data set that contains roads, those might be hierarchically ranked by their size of the road, from major highways to much smaller roads down to dirt roads and trails, or it might be information about traffic volume on those roads that gives them a hierarchy. Interval data can be numeric data based on a measurement scale with an arbitrary reference point, such as elevation, where ratio data is when we have numeric data that's obtained from a measurement scale with an absolute point of reference. So the example that the book gives to help us think about the difference between interval data and ratio data is that a interval data set that notes a 0-degree temperature does not denote the absence of temperature. Rather, it is a sort of arbitrary reference point on a scale. However, a forest inventory data set that estimates 0 for tree density is reflecting an absolute absence of tree density. Data processing is sort of the next step in analyzing spatial data through geographic information systems. We should be concerned about data accuracy, attribute errors, position errors, and correcting for those errors is a big part of that processing of data. Metafiles give us detailed information on our data and contain that might tell us the source, the type, the method of collection, the resolution or format that was used, and the constraints of those data. As examples of metadata, the Southeast Blueprint, some of the folks that we heard from a couple of weeks ago do an exceptionally good job of capturing metadata for each one of their data sets that they have used in developing the Southeast Blueprint. I've got a link here to the Southeast Blueprint. It'll be part of your exercise application this week to play with some of this data. So take some time to read through the metadata descriptions on the Southeast Blueprint website here. And this is just a sampling of the types of data that they have available. I want to mention that when you get into that Southeast Blueprint site, you can of course look at the blueprint itself, but the blueprint is comprised of dozens of data sets that inform that prioritization model, and that you actually can dig into each one of those. So what we have here is a sampling just under the terrestrial data sets of models and data that were collected to help with that prioritization. So this is an example for terrestrial forest birds, the model that was constructed and the description of how that was constructed, the reference for it, and also issues with the data set, which is nice to have that kind of transparency. The book goes through data processing tasks. I'm not going to read all these to you, but take some time to sort of read through if GIS is not already part of your day-to-day. Read through the processes here of reprojection, registration, resampling, reclassification, edge matching, vectorization, or rasterization, and coordinate thinning. We'll go through some of the most frequent functions that we see used for spatial ecology: area, distance, and neighborhood functions. So area distance functions are really some of the most basic spatial measurements that we see. They include point data and line data. Neighborhood functions incorporate the influence of neighboring points or cells on a given location. So what we see here is an example of buffering as a neighborhood function. Buffering is used to create a zone within a fixed location around a spatial entity. We might want to understand a buffer around some of our point data, or to create that in our analyses. We see the same here with line data and polygons. And then overlay functions are something that we frequently do. Again, they govern how spatial data layers are integrated together. So overlaying maybe presence and absence species data with presence and absence of habitat data. We see point in polygon overlays. That's used to uncover associations between spatial point data and land cover types. The example they give here are bird nests relative to habitat availability. We might see line and polygon overlays. For example, overlaying road data with forest polygon land use data as well. And then of course polygon with polygon overlays, where we might have a proposed boundary of a conservation reserve overlaid with a land cover map. I've got a couple of these that I should have easy access to in my computer files. This map is an example of an overlay function where we are using a neighborhood function of creating a buffer around a collection of swallowtail kite roost locations. This is along the Santee River in South Carolina. And so you can see the red dots depict where we have a concentration of birds roosting at night. We know that these birds are actually roosting during the post-breeding period, pre-migration, so they're selecting areas that they can really go and fatten up before they have to migrate to South America. And so presumably this is an area that has a high concentration of resource availability for the birds. So a buffer was created around these nighttime roost locations to give us a sense of what kind of land cover types that we're seeing in that immediate vicinity. I believe the scale of the buffer here is about 5 kilometers around the roost locations, and we have land cover types within that area. And this is another example where reclassification of our land cover might be warranted. It might be from a kite's eyes that deciduous forest and evergreen forest could actually be grouped into a single forest type, and where some of the more open habitat types like scrub-shrub layer or grassland herbaceous layer, pasture and hay could all be grouped into an open habitat type or early successional habitat type. From that same study on swallowtail kites, we have an example of point and polygon overlay here. It's worth reflecting on all the information that's being displayed with the point data. So these points, the different colors tell us which year the point was sampled, and the size of the points actually denote one of the attributes in the table, which would be the size of the roost, how many birds were actually counted in that particular roost site. A buffering element that was included on this map was the survey extent. So this data was collected through aerial flight surveys, and we have a pretty good understanding of the visual range that the scientist is able to capture with the survey, and so what area was actually surveyed is captured in that buffer area. And then last, the polygon data captured here of land ownership. So we actually have attributes of land ownership being conveyed, again with the 3 different colors here: private conservation easements in orange, federal ownership in darker green, and state ownership in lighter green. It makes some obvious inferences here about why we might want a map like this. It might help us target future areas for land conservation based on the location of these roost sites and the fidelity that we see to these roost sites year after year. So we have a couple of examples of interpolation functions. Triangulated irregular networks are an example, which are commonly used to produce contour maps or digital elevation models. The spatial moving average function uses a neighborhood filter and assigns a mean value to each location based on values that were sampled within that site. So the figure 22 gives you a sense of how sample data could be converted to an average mean based on spatial data, and this is something that we would see more frequently with raster data. Typographic functions can be applied to digital elevation models to allow us to view a more 3-dimensional visualization of the landscape. It can help us understand slope and curvature, concave or convex. It's important for understanding landscape processes such as runoff and erosion, transport and accretion or deposition of soils. So figure 23 gives us an example of what a three-dimensional rendering of a DEM might look like for Mount St. Helena. So analytic hill shading is a concept introduced under topographic functions as well. And it's something that allows us to calculate the location of shadows. And based on location and sort of density of shadows, we can use those to create a virtual relief in the landscape. This can be useful for estimating sunlight on the landscape. It can be used for modeling snowmelt, photosynthesis, or suitability for certain crops and vegetation. And then the book tells us a little bit about network analyses, which we'll hear more about in our connectivity chapter, chapter 5. So in general, network analyses are used to assess connectivity, and in one case is within landscape ecology. It's defined by a set of nodes and connected by lines, which can represent actual connections such as roads or rivers, or more virtual connections, such as how we foresee individuals or information flowing across the landscape. And it could be used to calculate a least cost or shortest path. An example of this, which we've already talked a little bit about, the Nature Conservancy's resilient and connected analysis, which is a tool to understand how terrestrial biodiversity will function in the face of climate change. One of the analyses that the Nature Conservancy did was a regional flow analysis, which was intended to tell us a little bit more at a broader regional scale about how we anticipate seeing plants and animals moving in the future and what places might be most important to conserve, to allow for that movement, regional range shifts across the landscape. And so in doing a network analysis for this, they actually a preference in the model for both upslope and northward movement, as well as movement through riparian areas. And so our channels of movement have a predefined preference based on our understanding of how climate change is going to encourage that both latitudinal and elevational movement of organisms. The book goes into a good bit of detail on some of the landscape metrics, and again into the some of the statistical principles around these metrics. We are not going to spend much time on the analytical side of these, but I do want you to understand the various metrics and concepts. So landscape richness is the number of different land cover types present in a landscape. Proportion of landscape cover, very intuitively, is for each land cover type, we can calculate the relative proportion of that type within the landscape. Landscape diversity allows us to calculate diversity for each land cover type, and we can weight this by its proportional abundance in the landscape using the Shannon Diversity Index. Landscape configuration includes defining patches within a landscape, the number of patches, the size of the patch, perimeter of the patch, the amount of edge present there, and the shape of the patch, aggregation of patches, and contagion. We think just about patch dynamics within a landscape. There's an entire discipline that has arisen, again, based partly on those theories of MacArthur and Wilson about island biogeography and the importance of landscape patch continuity or proximity. And so one of the first principles that the book talks through is how we define a patch spatially. When we're dealing with raster data and buffering, do we want to apply the 4-cell rule or the 8-cell rule of a patch to define how it is in the landscape? And our choice here can drastically change the results. So figure 425 shows us that we could either end up with one patch or 7 different patches based on our definition of patch when we upload that spatial information. Some of the patch scale measurements that we'd want to include patch area, patch perimeter, patch shape, patch isolation, and habitat continuity within the patches. If we move up a level to class scale measurements, we actually consider a lot of these same metrics, but we might consider the mean of those. So the mean or total patch area within a larger landscape, the total perimeter, or the mean shape of patches within a landscape. The same is true for habitat continuity, and then for number of patches. We might measure patch size variability within a larger landscape area, mean patch isolation, or various aggregation measures. And you guys can take the time to read through some of those in the book. I wanted to mention the concept that the book describes about neutral landscape patterns. This has been a useful development for landscape ecology to be able to use theoretical landscape models which simulate patterns and different amounts and distributions. We might have these randomly distributed across a landscape, and they can provide a baseline or a null hypothesis about how specific changes in the landscape are going to affect a value or a metric. So if we can create theoretical landscape models, it helps us to understand expected behavior. It might help us to figure out whether observed behaviors are due to a specific biotic or abiotic factor or not. The book goes over the effect of thematic resolution. So we sort of just visited this in that swallowtail kite example. It's important to remember that our landscape can appear to be more or less diverse depending on how we decide to classify land cover types. So this figure shows us that the same landscape could be classified as 5 different types or 3 different types depending on what classes we use. But our choice on classification in a certain landscape analysis really might depend on how we think the species interacts with the landscape that we're studying, if it is a species-based analysis. I wanted to mention the concept of gap analysis that is so important to conservation and landscape ecology. So conservation organizations and natural resource agencies started using GIS back in the 1980s, really to identify conservation priorities. And one of the first major efforts involved the process of overlaying several different data types for a planning region that was important. That included the existing protected areas, the land use types, vegetative communities, and then often the distribution of certain focal animal species, and to allow identification of gaps in protection. So this type of analysis in various forms have been incorporated in almost all the regional conservation planning efforts globally to date since then. And so your assignment this week is actually to sort of play with this concept of a gap analysis and to use some of the information we've learned this week to practice viewing landscapes, layering data, measuring, and putting forward what you think might be the most important parcels for protection in that Black River landscape using a couple of different data sets here. That's it.